An ordinary studio set turned into a political battlefield the moment Jasmine Crockett walked in, calm, composed, and carrying a truth the audience didn't see coming. Across from her sat Karoline Leavitt, sharp-tongued and riding a wave of right-wing confidence, ready to dominate the conversation. But what happened next? No one expected it. In a single moment, one piercing question, one deadly calm response, Crockett flipped the entire room on its head and left Leavitt speechless. This wasn't just a debate. It was a generational reckoning, a raw collision between slogans and substance, and one woman's refusal to be underestimated. If you believe in truth spoken with dignity, and if you've ever seen someone rise when they were expected to fall, this one's for you. Tap like, subscribe, and drop a comment with where you're watching from, because what you're about to witness will shake up everything you thought about who holds the real power. It was just after 7 p.m. when the studio lights warmed up the cold steel of the camera rigs, casting long reflections off the glossy floor of the Pulse studio. The audience was still shuffling into their seats, older couples holding hands, veterans in faded ball caps, women in pearls, retired teachers, and community volunteers. These weren't Twitter warriors or political influencers. They were Americans. Older, thoughtful, rooted in decades of watching politics rise and fall, loyal not to noise, but to truth. They'd seen Watergate. They'd seen 9/11. They'd survived recessions and seen presidents come and go. And tonight, many of them sat quietly with folded arms and quietly drawn expectations. They knew drama would come, but they also knew character reveals itself when the noise fades, and character, tonight, would be tested in real time. Elena Carter stood at center stage, framed in a tailored black suit that gave her the gravity of a judge and the poise of a veteran anchor. She wasn't there to entertain. She was there to ignite. "Good evening, America," she said, her voice measured and magnetic, like a verdict being read aloud. Tonight isn't just about sound bites. It's about who we are when the spotlight burns hottest. To her right, Karoline Leavitt, young, calculated, dressed in crisp red, sat like a chess piece ready for her opening move. Her confidence was unmistakable, shoulders squared, lips slightly curled, eyes scanning the audience like she already owned the stage. And to the left, Jasmine Crockett, poised, not loud, understated, yet radiant in a navy blue ensemble that seemed to soak in the room's energy instead of deflect it. She sat still, not because she wasn't ready, but because she knew exactly what she was about to do. The audience hushed as Carter spoke again, this time more deliberate. We live in a time where platforms like X and TikTok aren't just social spaces. They're battlefields. They influence elections. They influence hearts. So tonight we ask, where is the line between speech and safety? She turned to Leavitt. "Karoline, last week your administration defended X against calls for moderation. Many believe that this position endangers public trust. How do you respond?" Karoline leaned in, and her voice sliced the air with practiced rhythm. "Elena, it's not freedom of speech that's dangerous. It's who gets to define what's dangerous. Tech giants are not elected. They're not accountable. And yet, they silence millions of Americans, disproportionately those who believe in the America First movement. 70% of conservative posts flagged. 70%. That is not coincidence. That is censorship." A few nods in the audience, some murmurs of approval. Karoline's words hit like drumbeats, strong, clear, and familiar to those who felt pushed to the edge of society's conversation. Then came Jasmine. Her voice, lower and more controlled, didn't rise to meet Karoline's volume. It didn't need to. "Karoline, you talk about censorship like it's a game of tag, as if someone's chasing down conservatives just for sport. The reality is, platforms moderate content when lies start costing lives, when misinformation spreads about elections, about vaccines, about war zones. People get hurt. That's not control. That's responsibility." Gasps, some claps, and a shift in the audience, a subtle one. Some leaned in, others tightened their arms. Not everyone liked hearing that, but they were listening. Elena raised a brow. "Karoline, she says it's not about silencing, but saving. How do you square that with your support for deregulation?" Karoline didn't flinch. She smiled slightly. "Elena, when California sued X, for allowing a post on immigration policy. The court threw it out, said it was protected speech. Just because something makes people uncomfortable doesn't make it harmful. I ask, who decides what truth is? The government? Silicon Valley billionaires? Truth isn't fragile. It doesn't need a moderator. More applause, louder this time. Karoline leaned back, as if to say checkmate, but Jasmine wasn't blinking. Karoline, truth isn't fragile, she said, her voice now steady, rising like a tide. But democracy is. And when you let platforms become echo chambers for hate, for lies, for fear, you don't strengthen freedom. You erode trust. People don't know what to believe anymore. They don't know who to turn to. And that chaos, that serves no one. Elena looked between them. The tension was no longer rising. It had arrived. Carter turned the page on her notes and continued. Let's shift now to energy. Karoline, under your administration, domestic oil production is up. Gas prices have fallen, but environmental groups argue this is short-term thinking. How do you respond to their concerns? Karoline stood her ground. Elena, Americans can't save the planet if they can't afford to get to work. Under President Trump, gas prices dropped 20%. That means money in people's wallets. In California, where green energy policies rule, electricity costs twice the national average. People are choosing between heat and groceries. That's not justice. That's cruelty in the name of climate. Applause burst again, this time stronger, especially from the back rows. Karoline's words hit home for many who had watched utility bills eat away at fixed incomes. But Jasmine wasn't finished, not even close. Her voice was quiet now, but sharp, each word a deliberate strike. Karoline, you talk about savings, but you don't talk about the cost. The cost to children who can't breathe in Houston, to seniors hospitalized after record heat waves, to firefighters battling blazes that never used to reach this far north. You say you want to protect Americans? Start by protecting their air, their water, their homes. Silence, then applause, from the middle rows this time, from the woman with a walker, from the man in a Vietnam cap who'd lived through the Dust Bowl. Karoline's jaw tightened, just slightly. Elena Carter stepped forward, her voice clear. Energy, free speech, these aren't just policies, they are the bones of this country. But now we turn to something even more personal, education. Jasmine, in your home state of Texas, school boards are debating book bans and parental rights. Where do you draw the line between preserving tradition and silencing truth? Jasmine sat forward, and for the first time, her eyes didn't just meet Karoline's. They pierced through her. I believe parents should be involved in their children's education, she began, but not to erase it. Banning books on race, gender, and history doesn't protect children. It robs them. In my district, black kids, queer kids, immigrant kids, they need to see themselves in stories, not be told they don't exist. The room shifted again, quiet, heavy. Karoline responded quickly, her voice crisp. No one's erasing anyone. We're making sure 8-year-olds don't read explicit content. Parents have a right to decide what's appropriate. We're not banning history. We're protecting childhood. Are you? Jasmine asked. And then she leaned in. Because when a kid in Dallas is told his skin color makes him dangerous, and the book that proves otherwise is gone from the library, you haven't protected childhood. You've erased hope. The silence was not just thick. It was suffocating. And that's when the first real crack appeared. Karoline blinked, then shifted in her seat, just slightly. But it was there. Elena Carter let the silence stretch. She had the instinct of a journalist who knew when the real story had begun. Then she turned to the camera. We'll be right back after this break, but stay with us, because if you think you've seen fire, you haven't seen what comes next. As the commercial played, the audience didn't move. They didn't whisper. They didn't check their phones. Because the storm was just beginning. The second segment resumed, not with a roar, but with a silence that felt like thunder withheld. The camera panned across the studio audience, faces older, wiser, many worn, with decades of watching political theater, but rarely seeing true conviction. These were viewers who remembered when debates meant something, when ideas were wrestled with, not thrown like grenades across the aisle. They weren't here to be entertained. They were here to see truth break through noise, and they could feel it coming. Elena Carter stood center stage once more, her voice a precise scalpel. Thank you for staying with us. What we've witnessed so far is more than a clash of perspectives. It's a clash of generations, of philosophies, of how we define leadership in today's America. She turned, her gaze now fixed on Karoline Leavitt. Karoline, Jasmine has challenged the idea that your administration's policies support the people most affected, minorities, the working class, and those historically excluded from the mainstream narrative. What do you say to voters who feel that your positions favor economic strength over human dignity? Karoline shifted. Not enough for most to notice, but enough for those who'd been watching her closely. She inhaled and exhaled slowly. Elena, I reject the premise that prosperity and dignity are separate. Under President Trump, every American had the opportunity to thrive. Unemployment for Black Americans hit record lows, wages went up, energy costs went down, safety returned to our streets. We didn't choose between economy and equality. We made them work together. Her voice was firm, but something in the room didn't rise to meet her. The applause was lighter, shorter, because while her words were calculated, Jasmine's were resonating. Jasmine spoke, calm and slow like a judge delivering a verdict. You say safety returned. For whom? Because in my community, when police budgets soared and oversight vanished, what followed wasn't safety. It was fear, not of criminals, but of uniforms. And when wages rise but rent doubles and hospitals close in rural counties, what good is a paycheck when there's nowhere to sleep or heal? The air thickened. Even those who'd come in skeptical of her felt something pull inside them, something old, something honest. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She was speaking from a place deeper than politics. She was speaking from experience. Carter nodded, clearly recognizing the emotional current in the room. Let's talk about healthcare. Jasmine, in your district, hospital closures have led to rising maternal mortality. Karoline, your administration supports reducing federal oversight in healthcare markets. How do you respond to criticisms that this increases inequity for vulnerable populations? Karoline's tone sharpened. She was back on familiar ground. Elena, the federal government does not heal people. Doctors do. Families do. Bureaucrats don't need more power over our bodies. Communities need choices. Competition drives better care. It's government red tape that closes hospitals, not free markets. Some applause, louder now, but scattered, because even as she spoke, heads turned toward Jasmine, waiting. And Jasmine delivered. Her voice dropped, not for drama, but for truth. Tell that to the mother who drove 60 miles in labor because the only delivery unit within range was shuttered. Tell that to my aunt, who died waiting for approval for a surgery she couldn't pay for up front. Tell that to the child whose asthma got worse because the clinic near her was turned into a vape shop. You say government can't heal? Maybe not. But abandonment kills faster. The room gasped. This wasn't rhetoric. This was testimony. And older viewers, those who lived long enough to know that policy isn't theory but daily life, leaned in closer. Carter stood still. Her script had long since become irrelevant. She was navigating energy. Let's address foreign affairs. Jasmine, many argue that President Trump's America First strategy has isolated our allies. Karoline, can you explain how withdrawing from global partnerships strengthens national security? Karoline sat up straighter, regaining footing. Elena, strength is not isolation. Strength is self-reliance. The Trump doctrine was clear. No more endless wars. No more foreign aid for nations that despise us. NATO paid more, under us. China got tough sanctions. Peace talks replaced drone strikes. That's not retreat. That's leadership. The audience applauded again. Louder this time. Her delivery was clean. It was precise. But Jasmine didn't counter it with force. She countered it with stillness. Karoline, I've buried friends in uniform. I've sat with mothers who got folded flags instead of phone calls. America first shouldn't mean America alone. When Ukraine begged for help, we hesitated. When Taiwan signaled fear, we shrugged. And while China built ports, we built talking points. Diplomacy isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And if you think strength is measured by who fears us, not who trusts us, we've already lost. This time the silence didn't just come, it lingered. Elena Carter didn't even ask a question. The camera lingered on Jasmine's face, then Karoline's. The difference was striking. One was polished, the other was present. The final topic was the most volatile. Carter took a breath. We end with the issue that touches every family, every table, every faith, morality in public life. Karoline, your administration defends conservative values. Jasmine, you argue that morality must include inclusion, not restriction. Let's begin. Karoline moved first. America was built on Judeo-Christian values, family, discipline, responsibility. We are losing our soul to moral relativism, gender ideologies in elementary schools, pornographic content passed as art, boys and girls locker rooms. That's not progress, that's perversion, and this administration is drawing a line. Applause surged again. Roars, claps, cheers. She had tapped into something visceral, but Jasmine waited until the room began to settle. And then she stood, not dramatically, just deliberately. And when she spoke, her voice trembled at first, but not from weakness, from restraint. My mother was a church organist. She taught me that God doesn't need guards. He needs witnesses. And when you reduce faith to rules and rituals that hurt others, you don't defend it. You defile it. You think queer kids are threats? You think books are the enemy? What kind of God is that? Because the one I was raised to love taught compassion, taught grace, taught justice. She took a step forward. Karoline, you talk about protecting children. Then protect the kid who cries himself to sleep because he's different. Protect the girl whose silence is mistaken for obedience when she's really just afraid. Protect the truth, even when it doesn't look like you. Silence. Then, an older woman in the second row stood. She wasn't a plant. She wasn't young. She just stood and clapped, slowly, deliberately, then another, then another. Karoline looked stunned, not humiliated, but shifted, as if something she didn't expect had just entered the room. Carter finally spoke, her voice softer now. What we've seen tonight is more than disagreement. It's a reckoning. 2 women, 2 visions, 1 country, and you, the people, will decide what future we walk into. But even as the credits rolled, the room didn't move, because something sacred had been spoken, something most had never heard articulated on TV. Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive the debate. She redefined the moment, and in doing so, left a mark even silence couldn't erase. The night didn't end with the final applause. It only began. As the studio lights dimmed and Elena Carter disappeared behind the curtain, the audience lingered like witnesses to a storm, unsure if it had passed or was only pausing. The murmurs were hushed, not because people didn't want to talk, but because they didn't know how to articulate what they'd just experienced. This wasn't a typical television debate. This was something far more raw, more honest, more human. And for the older viewers, especially those seated near the front, those with years etched into their faces and lives, lined with both hardship and hope, it felt like truth had finally cracked through the screen. Backstage, Jasmine Crockett walked slowly down the corridor. Her staff flanked her, silent, stunned. But Jasmine didn't wear victory on her face. She carried something else, something heavier. A memory, perhaps. A weight. She had poured more than policy onto that stage. She had spilled her story, her family, her wounds, and in return, the audience had done something rare. They listened. Inside the press room, cameras buzzed, microphones extended, and reporters waited like wolves. But the first voice wasn't Jasmine's. It came from the older woman who had first stood to applaud her. "My son is gay," she said into a CNN camera, voice trembling. He's never felt seen by people like Karoline. But tonight, Jasmine didn't just speak. She saw him. She saw all of us. And I want her to know we see her too. The clip went viral within 30 minutes. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt sat stiff in the green room. Her team whispered, tapped furiously at phones, trying to control the narrative. But the energy was off. Something had cracked. Karoline wasn't used to silence. She was used to domination. But now, even her allies avoided her eyes. Her voice earlier had landed, sharp, strategic, targeted. But Jasmine had answered with soul. And you can't fact-check soul. You can't outspin lived pain. Fox News ran their coverage first, trying to recenter the spotlight. Leavitt holds the line on conservative values. Crockett plays identity politics. But the comments told a different story. Older viewers, the very demographic they counted on, flooded the thread. "I didn't agree with everything Jasmine said," one man wrote, "but she reminded me of my daughter. She spoke with heart. I respect that." Karoline looked polished, but Jasmine looked real, said another. And sometimes, real is what this country needs. Karoline's communications director tapped her screen again. "You're trending," she said, "but not for the reason we hoped." Karoline looked up, her voice low. "They're calling her what?" "The still flame," the aide replied, "because she burned quietly, but left everything scorched." Sec. Hours later, Jasmine returned to her hotel, exhausted. Her feet ached, her throat was dry. But the weight she carried had started to change shape, from burden to clarity, from silence to signal. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her laptop. Thousands of messages poured in. A retired Navy officer, a single mother, a school teacher from Kansas, a pastor from Alabama. They weren't all left-leaning. In fact, many opened with, "I don't usually agree with you, but..." Jasmine read them one by one, her fingers still, her eyes wide. And then she wept, not out of sorrow, but release. She had come into the debate with points and policies. She left with something rare, a movement. The next morning, cable news didn't know what to do with it. The script had flipped. The young conservative icon had been overtaken not by shouting, but by grace, not by factoids, but by fire. MSNBC leaned in. Fox tried to pivot, but no one could ignore what had happened. A clip replayed across all platforms, Jasmine standing, voice trembling, saying, "What kind of God is that? Because the one I was raised to love taught compassion." It struck deep, in pews, in kitchens, in church basements, in VFW halls. And it wasn't long before pastors started quoting her, before op-eds started calling her a new voice of faith-based justice, before churches, yes, conservative ones, began inviting her to speak, not as a politician, but as a truth-bearer. Karoline, meanwhile, took a different route. Her team launched a social campaign to remind voters of her moral clarity. The problem? Clarity without compassion feels cold. And when compassion enters the room, cold loses its edge. By week's end, both women returned to their home states. Jasmine was welcomed at the Dallas airport by crowds, flowers, mothers with kids, veterans, a boy holding a sign that said, "I'm the kid you protected." Karoline, too, was greeted, but the energy was different, respectful, but muted, as if people admired her mind, but not the moment. That weekend, a small-town newspaper in Tennessee ran a letter to the editor that went viral. "I'm a conservative." The letter read, "I voted red my whole life. But last night, I watched something I didn't expect. I watched a Democrat speak like a preacher. Not the kind behind a pulpit, but the kind who's been broken and rebuilt. I may not vote for her, but I'll listen to her, because she listened to us." Part 3 of this debate wasn't played on stage. It played out in living rooms, in heartbeats, in quiet moments of reconsideration. It played out when a man who'd written off Jasmine Crockett suddenly turned up the volume. It played out when a woman who hadn't gone to church in years suddenly found herself praying not for politics, but for people. And while Karoline's team ran analytics, Jasmine sat with her aunt, holding hands in silence. "You shook the room, baby," her aunt whispered. "No," Jasmine said softly. "I just told the truth, and for once, they didn't look away." Outside, the city bustled. The headlines changed, but something in the air had shifted. Jasmine Crockett had done more than win a debate. She reminded America what it means to speak from the soul and to listen with the heart. And that echo, it wasn't fading, it was growing. By Monday morning, the nation wasn't just talking about a debate, it was wrestling with a shift. In nursing homes and church basements, in family group texts and political forums, a single name kept surfacing: Jasmine Crockett. Not as a candidate, not as an activist, but as something older Americans hadn't seen in a long time. A voice that didn't rise to shout, but one that dug deep and didn't flinch. the kind of voice they remembered from their own youth, back when politics felt personal, when civil rights leaders stood at pulpits and courtroom steps, not behind Twitter handles. The comparison wasn't lost on them. She reminded many of someone they hadn't seen since the days of Barbara Jordan or Shirley Chisholm, a woman who didn't ask for attention but earned it by standing when it would have been easier to sit. The debate had cracked something open, and the country, especially the elder generation who'd lived through turmoil and triumph, couldn't stop replaying it. Senior communities in Arizona aired the recording over breakfast. Bible study groups in Mississippi asked to read her words aloud before prayer. Vets in Ohio, who still wore POW bracelets, said she reminded them of someone who fought without needing fists. She had become not a symbol of a party, but of a principle. Even those who didn't agree with her politics couldn't deny her presence. It wasn't brash, it wasn't scripted, it was raw. And in an age where everyone shouted over each other, Jasmine had lowered her voice and silenced a nation. Karoline Leavitt's team tried to recover the momentum. They booked her on talk shows, launched morning interviews, released polished reels, highlighting her most assertive lines. But it was clear the fire she tried to reignite was being smothered by something stronger: memory. The memory of Jasmine standing still, eyes full of defiance and compassion, asking, "What kind of God is that?" That line had cut through culture like scripture. People didn't just hear it, they felt it. That same day, in an Oklahoma diner that hadn't changed its wallpaper since 1972, a group of retired school teachers debated whether they'd ever seen anything quite like it. One leaned in and whispered, "She didn't speak like she was campaigning. She spoke like she was praying." And somewhere across the country, Karoline sat in her media office, staring at split-screen poll results, showing a drop in likability among voters over 55. Her team told her it was a fluke, a phase. But Karoline knew better. She knew she hadn't lost because she was wrong. She lost because the room stopped believing her. Because in that studio, Jasmine didn't just bring arguments. She brought truth wrapped in lived experience. Meanwhile, Jasmine was traveling again, not to campaign, but because invitations had started pouring in. Churches, universities, civic centers, not from her base, but from people who had never invited a Democrat into their space before. And she didn't go to gloat. She went to listen, to thank, to cry with them. In one stop, she met an elderly couple in Nebraska. The woman, a retired nurse, clutched Jasmine's hand and said, "I saw you speak, and I just want you to know, it healed something in me I didn't even know was broken." Jasmine smiled, her voice cracking. "Then I guess it was worth it." The husband, a man who'd voted Republican since Reagan, pulled out a folded note. It was his son's last letter before he died in Iraq. In it, the son had written, "I hope someday someone tells the truth, even if it costs them everything." The man said nothing else, just handed her the note and nodded. The footage of that exchange leaked to the press. It wasn't staged, it wasn't marketed, but within hours it was trending. And commentators, who once labeled her as fringe, began to admit something had changed. Karoline's supporters tried to push back. They launched new ads showing her surrounded by flags, speaking forcefully at rallies. But they felt hollow, not because the flag didn't matter, but because it had become background noise next to something more powerful: conviction. Not the kind that brags, the kind that bleeds. And then came the night of the town hall. This one wasn't televised. It wasn't moderated by journalists or media executives. It was held in a church gymnasium in Alabama, hosted by local pastors and faith leaders who wanted to talk about faith, politics, and morality. Jasmine was invited. So was Karoline. Only one showed up. Jasmine walked in without cameras, without a speech, just a notebook and a worn leather Bible her grandmother had passed down. She stood in front of 300 strangers, many who hadn't voted blue in decades, and she didn't talk at them. She asked them to share, and they did. Stories of fear, of frustration, of children lost to drugs, of pensions swallowed by hospital bills. And she listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't perform. She nodded. She cried. She prayed with them. When it was her turn to speak, she said only this: "I don't have all the answers, but I have ears to hear, and a heart that breaks when yours does." That's what leadership should start with. Not sound bites, but service. The entire room stood, not because she asked them to, but because they had to. Back in D.C., Karoline watched a grainy Facebook Live video of that moment from a staffer's phone. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She just turned away. And in that moment, even she knew she hadn't been defeated by politics. She'd been overtaken by humanity. Part 4 of the story wasn't about political wins. It was about spiritual ones. It was about something deeper than poll numbers. It was about redemption for a nation that had forgotten how to listen. And as Jasmine's words echoed through sanctuaries, kitchens, and digital streams, older Americans found themselves reflecting not on a debate, but on a call to return to compassion, to conscience, to truth. And as the week ended, one final clip surfaced, taken on a phone by a teenager who'd watched the debate with his grandparents. It showed his grandfather, a hardened veteran, wiping a tear from his eye as Jasmine's final words replayed on screen. He looked at the camera and said softly, "She didn't beat Karoline. She reminded us who we were supposed to be." And across a nation still aching for answers, that one sentence said everything. The tipping point had arrived, and it had come not with fire, but with faith. In the days that followed, something rare began to take hold. Not a viral moment, not a trending hashtag, but a quiet revolution. It didn't scream, it didn't flash, it didn't need to. It moved like roots under old soil, slow, deliberate, impossible to stop. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just spoken. She had stirred something buried beneath decades of noise, a hunger for leaders who didn't pretend to be perfect, but were honest enough to bleed. And among the generation that had once marched for civil rights, prayed through war, and held this country's conscience in their hands, her voice landed like rain on parched ground. In Florida, a retired judge wrote a letter to the editor. He had never donated to a Democrat before, but he had sent Jasmine $20 with a note. "Not because I agree with you, but because you reminded me what the law was supposed to feel like." In Pennsylvania, a retired steelworker told his granddaughter he finally understood what she meant by systemic injustice, not because he read it in a textbook, but because he saw it in Jasmine's eyes when she talked about the kid who cried himself to sleep. In Utah, a church choir paused their weekly rehearsal to recite Jasmine's quote, "Leadership starts with ears to hear and a heart that breaks when yours does," before they sang. In each of these places, the same thing kept happening. Conversations, honest ones, painful ones, real ones. For the first time in years, it felt like people were listening to each other, not to win, not to change minds, but to understand, to reflect, to rebuild. Back in Washington, Jasmine kept her schedule quiet. No press junkets, no primetime gloating. She met with pastors, with veterans, with mothers who had lost sons to war and to gun violence, with librarians in towns where books were being pulled from shelves. And in every conversation, she said the same thing. You deserve to be heard, not managed, not handled, heard. Karoline Leavitt, for her part, continued to press forward. Her team doubled down on visibility. She appeared on conservative radio, on late-night commentary shows, at rallies where the base still cheered her on with passion. But beneath the surface, cracks formed. She could still command the podium, but the nation's heart had shifted. The applause didn't echo as long. The headlines grew shorter. The interviews felt sharper, more defensive, as if something in the collective consciousness had shifted, and it had. One morning, Jasmine received an envelope from a small town in West Virginia. Inside was a photograph, black and white, worn at the edges, of a woman standing in front of a one-room schoolhouse, holding a Bible in one hand and a sign in the other. Truth doesn't need permission. On the back was a note. This was my mother in 1965. I saw her in you. Keep going. Jasmine held the photo to her chest and wept, because she wasn't just fighting for policy. She was standing in a lineage of women who refused to bow. The final town hall came unexpectedly. A bipartisan group of retired legislators invited both women to sit in a library auditorium, not to debate, but to discuss, to reflect, to explain what they believed leadership should be. Karoline came polished, poised, prepared with talking points. Jasmine came with nothing but a notebook, a pen, and that same leather Bible. They sat side by side, No podiums, no stage lights, just 2 chairs, and a room full of people waiting for something real. The moderator, an 81-year-old former senator, leaned in and asked the first question. "What do you regret most from that debate night?" Karoline hesitated, smiled tightly. "I regret that we didn't focus enough on policy. I think feelings overwhelmed facts." Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink. She just said, "I regret not calling her by her first name sooner, because no matter how deep we disagree, we're still both trying to serve the same people. And I should have honored that more clearly." A murmur rippled through the crowd, through the keys. The moderator asked again, "What do you believe America needs right now, more than anything else?" Karoline answered with strength, "Direction, security, stability." Jasmine waited, then spoke, "Humility, listening, grace." The room went silent, and then the moderator, his voice shaking, closed the evening with this: "I have watched this nation grow, fight, break, and rebuild. I have seen presidents rise and fall. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, I am reminded that leadership isn't about who speaks louder. It's about who listens longer." The audience stood. Some clapped, some cried. And Jasmine? She didn't smile. She simply nodded. Later that evening, as they walked out of the building under a soft drizzle, Karoline reached out her hand. Jasmine looked at it, then took it. And in that moment, there was no winner, no loser, just 2 women who had given everything they had, one trying to hold onto a system, the other trying to transform it. And the people, they didn't crown anyone, but they knew whose voice echoed in their hearts. The revolution wasn't loud, it was quiet, it was faithful, and it had only just begun.